A Time of Changes was written in 1971 by Robert Silverberg. There's a YouTube channel that I really look up to, and that's the Sci-Fi Finds YouTube channel. And because of his love for Silverberg, I decided to give one of his books a shot. This book is set in the future, where humans have proliferated to a bunch of other planets, one of which being Velada-Borthan. On this planet, life is ruled by the Covenant, which is sort of like a religious order where people are very against the self. The worst things you can say in this society are possessive pronouns like I and me. They're like the dirtiest slurs. And that's because, according to the Covenant, you're really not supposed to talk about yourself too much. They think that it leads to, quote, self-indulgence, self-pity, and self-corruption. There are only two exceptions to this. First, when you are born, you're assigned a bond brother and a bond sister, which are even closer to you than your actual siblings, if you have any. You still can't say I or me or things like that to them, but you can talk to them about yourself and your aspirations and such. The other exception are these figures called drainers. These are sort of like in Catholicism, when you go to confession, it's sort of a mix between that and some sort of therapy session where you're allowed to talk about your sins and fully self-indulge during these sessions. The world in general is written in a really traditional light, so it kind of feels like it's like the 1600s or something, but they mention things like phones and airplanes and stuff like that, and then you're kind of reminded it's the future. There's not any like crazy sci-fi tech like teleportation or ray guns or anything, but they at least have sort of the modern technology. There is a decent amount of world building, but it's all sort of presented in a way that I don't necessarily like too much. It reminds me of like reading a textbook where there's a chunk and that's a lecture for a few pages, and then there's the actual implementation of all the world building through action. Personally, rather than the narrator monologuing, I'd much prefer to have the world building baked into the action of the book, which I honestly don't think that Silverberg did a great job of. Okay, so let's talk about the main character, Kanal Daraval. He is writing this story as a journal retrospectively on his life as he has been exiled for some reason. Now, one might think that for a story about encouraging people to love themselves, you might get an average Joe character, or maybe even someone a little bit abnormal, or maybe a little bit ugly. But that's where my first real criticism of the book comes into play. The main character, who's supposed to be this prophet for loving yourself, is a very traditionally attractive and well-off man. He's very well-off financially, and he's actually born into royalty. In terms of his body, he totally loves it. He's tall, he's got bulging muscles, he loves his nose, he's got attractive hair, and just a generally beautiful body. And he also has a huge cock. It just was so annoying. Like, is he the best one to relay this message about loving yourself? Because, of course, it would be easy for him. He has a classically perfect, enviable body. That's like a billionaire advocating for lower taxes. It's like, duh, you're advocating to make your life easier. So, I don't know, this just really put me off. Okay, so as I hinted at it, the big theme of this book is the importance of loving yourself and validating your own thoughts and feelings about yourself, which is very counterculture in this society that Silverberg has created. This is where I feel pretty torn. The entire book portrays a society that pretends to be obsessed with this notion of selflessness, but they don't follow through on this at all in the way that people live in this culture. If a society is obsessed with collective self, you would think that it would have turned into this like pseudo-communism, but no, it's pretty much a monarchy, and the society has an extremely large wealth gap in the book. This selfishness also manifests itself in other ways, like how they're super strict on having everyone like fill out extremely specific legal contracts for everything down to just like a small favor. And you would think that in a society like this, people would also not be able to engage in self-indulgent acts, but it seems like everyone drinks, has sex with hookers, and does other stereotypically self-indulgent things. So the whole book, Silverberg is trying to make this case that this society is selfless. yet everyone acts very selfishly except for the way that they speak. And so the reason that I'm torn is that on the one hand, I can see how this was probably set up on purpose to highlight the hypocrisy of the culture, but on the other hand, I just feel like it was pretty poorly written. I would like to have seen some other societal things set up in this book to make it seem like they actually at least thought that they were setting up a selfless society, but literally the only thing that was set up like this was the language. And in my eyes, this just felt like pretty lazy world building. The other thing about this that I really disliked was how the main character overcame the trap of society having this false understanding of selflessness. And this is maybe a light spoiler, but in some of the book inserts they mention this, so I don't really think it's that big of a thing. The way that Kanal ends up fully understanding the importance of loving yourself and loving others and understanding yourself is via a hallucinogenic drug. When he takes it, he learns how to collectively love everyone, and that includes himself. It becomes clear to him that by his society being hypersensitive to not being selfish, they actually themselves become super selfish. And then he believes it's his job to share this message. But the only way that he can get this message out to people is by having them do this drug. And maybe I'm just like a prude, but to me, if the message is really only receivable and logically understandable by doing a drug, I think that the message loses a lot of its oomph. I thought it was super lame, and I felt like it would have just been a lot more powerful if his message had been proliferated by just helping people receive the message as a sober epiphany. Anyway, while this theme of true selflessness was definitely the main theme of the book, there were definitely some other smaller themes as well. First, I'm going to touch on one that I actually really liked. There is some pretty good commentary on religion. There's this earthling that Kanal meets, and their discussion of religion leads to some really interesting insights. Like, for example, the earthling, who is agnostic, has a lot of envy for Kanal and his society's devout convictions about the almighty gods. He expresses that even though he doesn't think that he can believe in it, he truly longs for that sort of comfort in life, that comfort that there is this all-loving higher power in the form of gods that you can trust with all things. And if you've watched my review of Hell is the Absence of God, the short story, you will have probably heard me express how interested I am in this type of sentiment. Another one that I'm less fond of is of his commentary on Aboriginal people. So Kanal starts off sort of seeing the Aboriginal people as lesser people, and then he shifts into that very stereotypical change of heart that like, oh, all these people are much more like us than I thought. And this falls really flat, in my opinion, though, because it's really done in dialogue only. In terms of how he acts, though, he's still extremely condescending to them. He still highlights their savageness, he talks down on the people, and he flippantly has sex with many of their women, and then is scared about getting STDs from it because he thinks that they're dirty. So I feel like the idea was there with this theme, but it felt really shallow and like it wasn't really capitalized on very well. Maybe it was progressive for 1971, though. All right, I want to talk about the women in this book for a second. I'd love to like cathartically bitch and moan and give examples of the sexism in this book, but this book is from 1971. I think that when you read a book from this era, it's unfair to judge it by today's standards, and you do need to read it trying to understand the book at least a little bit from that time period's perspective. So I'm going to save you from me bitching like the pissed off, annoying liberal that I am, and I'm just going to say this. Kanal is like a racist uncle. Every time that a minority walks into the room or comes on TV, they're going to make an uncomfortable comment about them. But in this book, it's like that with women. Literally any time that a woman enters the plot, you know that Kanal is either going to have sex with them, talk about having sex with them, fantasize about having sex with them, or comment on them in some sexual manner. Literally every single woman in the book. And I get it, it was written in 1971, but I'm entitled to say that it feels really, really, really dated regarding women. But take that however you want to. So yeah, I have a lot of criticism about this book, but I did find the book really easy to turn to and really easy to read and actually quite comforting. I was reading this at the same time as another J.G. Ballard book that I'll be reviewing in the future, and I felt like, unlike that book, this was a book that I could settle in for bed with. Maybe its focus is a little less complicated than some of the books that I have read recently, but I liked it. It did bother me that it felt like the whole biggest theme of the book was done sort of clumsily regarding the message of the value of loving and understanding yourself and others holistically, but there were enough interesting themes and the prose was snappy enough to make it a pretty okay read. Maybe this is just cope for me not wanting to feel like I've wasted my time, but I feel like sometimes reading a not so great book is about finding that one enjoyable nugget out of it. Like maybe for me it was the interesting religious commentary that they had, and you can just magnify this and really get a lot out of a reading experience, even if the overall book isn't 100% your cup of tea. So overall, I am glad that I looked into Silverberg. I'm not sure I'm exactly itching to read the next of his novels, but I do feel like it was a fun little time capsule in new age science fiction. Thanks for watching.